Hello, dear viewers. Today we're going to be talking about NATO and about a statement made by NATO about its relations with China. Let's begin. Hello, today welcome to Global Nationalism. Let's start with the earlier in this week. The NATO foreign ministers met and they gave a statement about China where they discussed their policy towards China. I want to talk about that because we're seeing uh, mainly the US, but the West in general, kind of being more active about what China's doing in China's backyard, the Pacific Ocean, and they're talking about supporting countries in the Indo-Pacific against China, and they're also worried about China's influence on their economies. But this is a problem for NATO because it's a North Atlantic alliance, not made for threats in other regions such as the Indo Pacific. So there is some uh, dispute between the members as to how much focus they should give to China, especially with Russia's uh, invasion of Ukraine. So let's first start with the statement made by NATO ministers regarding China. NATO foreign ministers end their meetings in Bucharest with focus on China, more support for partners. NATO foreign ministers ended 2 days of meetings in Bucharest on Wednesday, with meetings focused on the long term challenges posed by China. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says that NATO is an alliance of Europe and North America, but the challenges we face are global. So, this is basically a kind of a code language saying that although NATO was made to defend Europe against Russia, now the challenges they face include China, which is outside of the Atlantic region, and so they have to focus on China. They also stressed the importance of meeting NATO's resilience guidelines, maintaining NATO's technological edge, and continuing to strengthen cooperation with partners in the Indo Pacific region and with the European Union. The war in Ukraine demonstrated a dangerous dependency on Russian gas, and that this should also lead us to assess our dependencies on other authoritarian regimes, not least China, for our supply chains, technology, or infrastructure. They will continue to trade and engage economically with China, but they have to be aware of our dependencies, their vulnerabilities, and manage the risks. So, this isn't like what Trump did when Trump was trying to disengage from China. They're still going to trade with them, but they are going to be careful about their dependency, becoming too dependent on China for critical supplies and technology. And they about Ukraine, they promised um, more support, continued longer term support. Now, as I said earlier, NATO nations generally have been hesitant to join the US to uh, work against China because they feel it's not part of their national interests, because specifically European NATO countries. But the US is simply very worried about China and is trying to get the European countries to go along with it, to go against China. A senior State Department official, according to the New York Times, said that the United States hoped to persuade the other nations that they had to be more cautious on Chinese investments and operations on infrastructure projects, including ports, and on trade involving technology. This is a reference to how Chinese investments and loans are being given to other countries, which are those loans are very cheap, but they are become over time they become too expensive for the countries to pay off, and then China takes over the infrastructure project that's built. This happened in Sri Lanka. So the US is worried this could happen in Europe. Uh, Mr. Blinken, the Secretary of State for the US, talks about this, saying this is not about taking NATO acting out of area. This is about some of the challenges that China poses in area to countries that are members of NATO and making sure that, for example, we're building resilience around our infrastructure. This shows that they seem to be worried about China getting some influence into their critical infrastructures, like I guess cyberspace, power, and other sectors. Now let's see what NATO's main critique about China is. Anthony Blinken talked about it, saying that NATO allies are concerned about China's rapid and opaque military buildup and its cooperation with Russia, and discussed concrete ways to address the challenges. So, this is what worries NATO, that China is building up its military and it's a very opaque manner. They're not really able to understand what is happening because China is not being transparent with them. I don't understand why they expect China to be transparent with them, since they've portrayed China as a rival, as some sort of opponent. So why would China be transparent about their military buildup with them? It's a bit of an odd concern. And mainly this is because the US is afraid that China will eventually become more powerful than it. A Pentagon report said that China would likely have a stockpile of 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035 at its current nuclear buildup pace, underscoring mounting US concerns about Beijing's intentions for its expanding arsenal. Now, what does countries like Russia think about NATO's uh, policy towards China? According to Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, NATO is trying to drag India into an alliance targeting Russia, China. The Russian foreign minister on Thursday accused NATO of trying to drag India into what he called an anti Russian and Chinese alliance. And he said the United States and NATO are trying to ratchet up tensions in the South China Sea and have tried to subvert any regional bodies designed to promote dialogue, such as the OSCE in Europe and ASEAN in Asia. This references the claims made by China of having territorial sovereignty over the South China Sea, which other countries in the South China Sea dispute. I must disagree with Russia here that I don't think it's the United States and NATO that is ratcheting up the tensions. I think it's China itself by making these territorial claims. They should respect the borders of other countries and not try to claim their territory. That's because of their actions. These countries are leaning towards the US for protection against China. So, well, now, what are the national interests of the countries in NATO and how do they relate to China? That is what I think should determine NATO's policy towards China. Firstly, it's to make sure that China does not gain economic power over them, that they remain economically independent. For this, they need to make sure that their trade is properly balanced, that China gives access to its markets to European goods and services. And in also China's activities such as um, giving loans to European countries and sending spies to European countries to try to influence their leadership, including the US's, where so, there's some evidence that Joe Biden and his family are in somewhat, uh, I'm not sure what the correct word to use is, but some people allege that they are influenced by the Chinese Communist Party and that they are not fully independent to interact with them. So, yeah, that is both things are threats to NATO countries, but I must say that what China does in the Indo Pacific is not a direct threat to NATO countries, especially European countries. So, but it is a threat to the allies, the Asian allies of the US. So, the US, I understand, has a responsibility to protect these countries, but still, I don't think that this is a core interest for the US. I think the US's main interest is to prevent China from attacking its homeland, which the Pentagon says might happen in the mid and distant future. But also, it must be said that if China attacks countries like Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, India, and takes over their resources, it will become more powerful and might try to block the US from accessing resources in the Pacific Ocean, in the Indo Pacific, and this would hurt the US's economy. So the US can't allow that to happen because China does have plans to become the world's most powerful country, and for this they do intend to displace the US. They've said that they don't want to, but I think that their actions show that they do. But they don't want to attack the US. They don't want to invade the US or anything like that. They just want to be more powerful than the US. Now, NATO also spoke about Taiwan. I must say that Taiwan should be considered as an internal issue for China because both Taiwan and mainland China are ruled by Chinese governments. One is the People's Republic of China and the other is the Republic of China. Both claim to be the true government because they fought a civil war and the Republic of China lost that and moved to Taiwan. So I think both sides must come to some agreement and outside countries should not be involved. And that can avoid a war between China and Taiwan, which would might bring in the United States, Japan, and other Pacific countries into protect Taiwan, which would cause a big war, which would affect the entire continent of Asia, which no one wants. So, yeah, I think it's best that the NATO not get involved in Taiwan issue, but I know that's not going to happen. There, the U.S. is already too involved. In fact, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan earlier this year was somewhat of a provocation to China, trying to egg them to invade or at least border harass Taiwan to make China look like a enemy for the American people watching the news. So, yeah, I think that NATO should maintain economic independence from China, but it doesn't have to view China as some great enemy. It doesn't have to support the US in its uh, competition with China. It has to act in its own interests. And that is what nationalism was all about, to act in your own country's interests. If you like that video and want to see other videos about NATO, click here. If you want to see my previous video, click here. If you want to see the sources I use for this video, click the links in the description below. Thank you for watching. Vande